This is AMTV. Hello there everyone, and welcome to part 15 of this series looking at the history and impact of Doctor Who viewing figures. If you're joining us for the first time, a very warm welcome to you. We hope you stick around for future instalments and check out our previous episodes. We've covered the first 3 Doctor's eras and the first 3 years of the 4th Doctor. But for now, sit back, relax, and join me once again as we delve back into the wonderfully niche world of Doctor Who viewing figures. Our destination? Season 15. By the spring of 1977, Doctor Who was arguably at a new peak in its popularity. Season 14 had recently concluded, with audience averages skyrocketing over the preceding 6 months. Stories were averaging over 10, 11, even over 12 million viewers in some cases, and despite the criticisms of violence and content that was too frightening for children, audience interest had arguably never been higher. A day after the season wrapped up, a lively arts documentary, Who's Doctor Who, aired on BBC Two, celebrating the history of the programme thus far, and with host Melvyn Bragg even saying,
Doctor Who's now been on the air for 13 years, and it's become a national institution.
However, nothing of that magnitude lasts forever, certainly not in the realm of TV. A change-up was occurring within the Doctor Who production team. After 3 very successful years, producer Philip Hinchcliffe and script editor Robert Holmes decided to call time and head on to pastures new. Replacing them were Graham Williams and Anthony Reid respectively. Reid wouldn't actually officially begin work until the latter half of season 15, but even so, the tone and style of this run of stories is markedly different from the preceding 3 years. But just because things are changing doesn't mean Doctor Who is destined for failure. On our journey so far, we've seen viewing figures rise and fall due to change. So what would this particular shift have in store for Doctor Who's hyper-popularity? Let's take a dive in and find out, starting with a rather eerie opener. The first story from season 15 is the horror of Fang Rock. The TARDIS lands on an island off the coast of England in 1902. There, the occupants of a lighthouse and the survivors of a shipwreck fall victim, one by one, to a ruthless alien that has the ability to transform its appearance. This story is comprised of 4 episodes, which began airing on the 3rd of September 1977 and concluded on the 24th of the same month. Here are the individual viewing figures for all 4 episodes, and wow, okay, this is not what I was expecting. The numbers here are all still very respectable, and the final 2 parts just miss out cracking the 10 million mark, but after the consistent double figures week after week we saw with season 14, to kick things off with such a drop is honestly quite astounding, especially part 1's 6.8 million figure. In terms of the top 40 TV programmes, parts 1 and 2 missed out, but parts 3 and 4 both re-entered the chart comfortably, both charting at 23rd place. So what happened here with Horror of Fang Rock to get the viewing figures off to a fairly slow start? Well, one of the biggest factors to have an impact on said figures is promotion. Considering this is the start to a new season, you would have thought Horror of Fang Rock would have had a lush spread in the Radio Times to hype audiences up, just as it had done for the past 2 season openers. Unfortunately, this time around, just a small monochrome photo of the leads was issued to herald the return of the Time Lord to viewers' screens. You could argue after the stellar success of season 14 that the BBC perhaps thought the show would once again sell itself, as it were, but then considering this was in the days before things like the internet, listings magazines like the Radio Times were one of the few ways to properly know if your favourite show was returning, and if it was presented in a low-key way like this, people could have easily missed it. However, whereas promotion in the print world wasn't too strong, it was considerably better in the TV world. On the morning of Part 1's broadcast, a special trailer for Horror of Fang Rock was broadcast, setting up the gloomy lighthouse setting for viewers at home. These trailers often could have had quite a positive impact on Doctor Who, and I'm sure it made some audience members aware that morning that the show was returning merely hours later. But what about the other main factor we look at, competition? Did any offerings from the other side finally begin to take some of the wind out of Doctor Who's sails? Well, for Part 1, the competition was certainly diverse across the regions. You had imported emergency adventure series, Code R, quiz show, Mr. and Mrs., animation with the Jetsons, and a staple of old films. From Part 2 onwards though, most regions adopted the schedule of spy-themed game show, The Master Spy, followed by popular talent show, New Faces, a programme that had been challenging Doctor Who for the past few years, with mixed results. But as mentioned before, the viewing figures built up over Horror of Fang Rock's 4-week run, and when you look at the story itself, it's clear to see why. It's an adventure that feels both classic and timeless, but also brimming with menace and the science fiction threat of the alien Rutan. The setting of a lighthouse on a stormy night, it oozes the essence of quintessential horror, and despite calls from the BBC higher-ups to tone down the violence for the new season, it is worth noting that every single guest character ends up dead by the end of the story. It's more than just a bloodbath though. It's witty, funny in places, and one of the gems of the more gothic, atmospheric stories told in the 1970s era of Doctor Who. If you've got a taste for the more eerie, creepier stories, then this is one you'll certainly want to take note of. Overall, this story attracted an average of 8.4 million viewers, a 1.1 million drop from the previous season opener, The Mask of Mandragora. Whilst this may seem quite a dip, it is 0.9 higher than the season 13 opener, Terror of the Zygons, and comparisons aside, 8.4 million is a very respectable average, hardly one the BBC were going to start ringing alarm bells over. Whilst it may not kick season 15 off with the high numbers the previous batch of stories achieved, Horror of Fang Rock is still, in my opinion, one of the true gems in the Tom Baker era. A gorgeously dark and witty script from Terrance Dicks, top performances all round, and horror and thrills aplenty despite a limited location, is something Doctor Who has often pulled off to the highest degree. To experience it today, you can read the Target book from 1978, or its audio adaptation from 2017. To watch it, you have the VHS release from 1998, and a standalone DVD from 2005. This story would be Terrance Dicks' last contribution to the show for a good few years. He would return to write more adventures in the 1980s, including the 20th anniversary celebration, The Five Doctors. I highly recommend you revisit Fang Rock today. It's one of those 4-part adventures that whizzes by, but with plenty of memorable moments and a wonderful writing style to keep your eyes firmly fixed on the screen. And watch out for that Rutan.
Leela, I've made a terrible mistake. I thought I'd locked the enemy out. Instead, I've locked it in. With us.
The second story from Season 15 is The Invisible Enemy. In the year 5000, mankind has ventured beyond the Earth, but out in space, a sentient virus, the Swarm, is waiting. With the Doctor contaminated by the nucleus of the Swarm, clones of himself and Leela must journey into his own brain to confront the enemy. This story is comprised of 4 episodes, which began airing on the 1st of October 1977 and concluded on the 22nd of the same month. Here are the individual viewing figures for all 4 episodes, and these are a bit more consistent across the 4 weeks, but there is a noticeable drop. The last 2 parts of the previous story just missed out on 10 million viewers, whereas here, the part that achieved the highest viewership was part 1 with 8.6 million. And whilst the remaining figures are definitely decent, unlike seasons 13 and 14, whose second stories all received a noticeable increase from the opener, that same boost hasn't happened here. In terms of the top 40 programmes, only part 1 made the chart, just, finishing at the very bottom at 40th place. So what's going on here? Why aren't the numbers picking up like they had been doing across the past few seasons? Well, let's start off with the competition this time, and see what ITV had to combat the Invisible Enemy with. Some regions retained the same shows, such as New Faces and The Master Spy, but many regions began airing a new American sci-fi series, Man from Atlantis. Interestingly, this show hadn't done so well of its native US, but over here, it actually proved to be quite the success, and as such, it actually took a sizable chunk of audience viewership and attention away from Doctor Who. The first real threat to the show's dominance of the Saturday time slot for quite some time. To have any real chance of standing up against this new challenger's success, the promotional arm would have to be working overtime in order to try and win back viewers' attention. A short trailer was aired directly after the conclusion of Horror of Fang Rock, and on the morning of Part 1's transmission, but in the print world, things were really kicking off. The arrival of a new assistant for the Doctor was doing the rounds, but this new friend wasn't a humanoid, but in fact a robot supercomputer, in the shape of a dog. That's right, this story marked the very first appearance of K9. The introduction of the Tin Dog was part of the show's new remit, to strip away the gothic and more horror-based overtones of the show to make way for more comedy and light-hearted elements. As predicted, K9 would be an instant success with the youngest end of the audience demographic. That's not to say older fans didn't enjoy him too, but I think it's fair to understand that a portion of the older audience might have rather tuned in to Man from Atlantis than witness a robot dog join the TARDIS. K9 aside, the Invisible Enemy goes for some very ambitious set pieces. Some of the model work and the scenes inside the Doctor's body are very adventurous for 1977, and in many ways it's a sweet homage to the classic sci-fi film Fantastic Voyage. It's not a tremendously memorable story in my opinion, but for the introduction of one of the most iconic companions and some neat special effects, it certainly is far from the worst that Who has to offer. Overall, this story attracted an average of 7.9 million viewers, a 0.5 drop from the previous story. It's never nice to see viewership decline, especially considering the highs of the past few seasons, but it's always good to keep in mind that 7.9 million is perfectly decent for 1977, but probably not what the BBC were expecting or hoping for. We also have some repeat data for you. The Invisible Enemy was one of 2 stories from Season 15 chosen for a repeat airing in the summer of 1978, providing a build-up to Season 16 beginning in September. Airing across 4 consecutive Thursdays from the 13th of July till the 3rd of August, here are the viewing figures for this repeat. These numbers are considerably lower than the original transmission, and the average of 5.6 million is over 2 million less than on first airing, but as we've seen in the past, these lower figures are actually quite typical for this time of year. July and August were still relatively quiet months for television, with audiences choosing to stay outdoors longer whilst the sunny weather was about. Plus, when going up against popular soap opera Crossroads and sitcom Leave It to Charlie, this further lessened the repeat's chances of higher viewing figures. The Invisible Enemy is one of those stories that people either seem to love on first sight, or completely push to one side for having a robot dog and a monster that looks interesting. For me, I can stick it on and still have a good time. It's certainly not unwatchable. I prefer to view it as more a product of the time, especially in terms of the special effects. In a world that was just beginning to embrace the behemoth that was Star Wars, for a small British sci-fi show with a limited budget to pull off some of the scenes it does is honestly quite remarkable. To give it a go for yourself, you can read the Target book from 1979 or its audio adaptation from 2018. To watch it, you have a VHS release from 2002, one of the last titles to be released on the format, and a few years later, in 2008, it was released on DVD, alongside K9 and Company as part of the K9 Tales set. If you're a fan of K9, you'll probably enjoy his introductory story, and if you haven't already seen it, I would argue like any Who adventure, it's always worth one go to see what you make of it. And if, like me, you hadn't watched it for many years, stick it on again. Who knows? You may end up viewing it in a completely different light.
Negative, no entry, no entry.
Look, whatever you are, I
am K9, and I am warning you.
Look, I came to see the doctor. I arrived with him.
I do have offensive capability. You have been warned. Retreat.
The third story from Season 15 is Image of the Fendahl. Arriving at Fetch Priory in the English countryside, the Doctor and Leela discover that dark forces are gathering. Attempts to unlock the secrets of a skull that predates the birth of man release the Fendahl, an ancient evil that could destroy the world. This story is comprised of 4 episodes, which began airing on the 29th of October 1977 and concluded on the 19th of November. Here are the individual viewing figures for all 4 episodes, and like The Invisible Enemy, the numbers for the most part remain fairly consistent across the story's run. Part 4 stands out as a noticeable highlight, attracting 9.1 million viewers, a nice 2.4 jump from where things began with Part 1, which had 6.7 million tuning in. Sadly though, for the top 40 TV programmes, not a single part managed to chart. Part 4 came the closest, finishing at 46th, but this marks the first time that Doctor Who missed out on the top 40 for quite some years. So, now that the show has been ousted from the charts, what was it that kept it from doing so? Well, in regards to competition, it's fairly obvious that ITV felt they had finally found a winner and ran with it. Most ITV regions were now airing Man from Atlantis directly against Doctor Who, and the American import continued to dominate the time slot in terms of viewing figures. But for Doctor Who to still retain roughly 7 million viewers at least for most weeks is a strong sign of the 14-year-old show's resilience. The promotion for Image of the Fendahl wasn't as extensive as it was for The Invisible Enemy. The new story did receive a short trailer, just as the previous adventures had done, and most national newspapers carried publicity photos of the 2 leads outside the gates of Fetch Priory. Members of the guest cast for this story were a focus for promotion too, including the appearance of Wanda Ventham, one of the most distinguished British actors of the day. As an interesting side note, this story marked the first occasion that the Radio Times listings credited the main character as the Doctor, though the on-screen credits still carried the Doctor Who moniker. Image of the Fendahl itself echoes many of the gothic overtones that were present in seasons 13 and 14. A dark atmospheric landscape, possessions aplenty, and some truly tense moments throughout the story's 4 parts. The Fendahlin as monsters look a little, interesting, and can often be derided as being the butt of a very inappropriate childish joke, but for their purpose in the story, I actually think they work quite well. The writer, Chris Boucher, delivers a fine script indeed. Having written the previous season's Robots of Death, it's great to see him return once again, with a story that could have easily slotted into the Hinchcliffe and Holmes era. Speaking of that duo, Image of the Fendahl would prove to be Robert Holmes' last story in which he would serve as script editor, with Anthony Reed fully taking over the duties from him. And for his final script to edit being one filled to the brim with lashings of horror, suspense and sharp wit, it's a fitting way for Holmes to make his exit from the series, at least in terms of being its script editor. It's certainly not the last we'll see of him. Overall, this story attracted an average of 7.8 million viewers, a 0.1 drop from the previous story. It's good to see that the drops are getting less severe, and 7.8 million is another decent average for Season 15 to notch onto its belt. And as mentioned before, despite the competition at ITV snatching away a good chunk of audience members, the fact that Doctor Who was able to still retain a decent audience size in the face of these newer programmes coming in is a testament to how ingrained the show was in the hearts and minds of the British viewing public. Like many stories in Season 15, Image of the Fendahl often gets a bit overlooked. I think it's one of the strongest stories from the batch, and highly recommend that you experience it for yourself. To do just that, you can read the Target book from 1979, or its audio adaptation from 2020. To watch it, you have the VHS release from 1993, or a standalone DVD release from 2009. If you loved the more horror-esque stories from the early years of the Tom Baker era, then Image of the Fendahl should scratch that same itch for you. An intriguing script, some top performances from all the cast, and in a way, a true signifier that the end of these more dark, gloomy stories are at an end. At least for now. If there's one thing we've learned from our Doctor Who journey so far, it's that nothing ever stays the same forever. The fourth story from Season 15 is the Sunmakers. Landing on Pluto in the far future, the Doctor is surprised to discover it is inhabited. The human population is subjugated by extortionate taxation imposed upon them by the ruling company, so the Doctor and Leela lend their hands to the rebellion. This story is comprised of 4 episodes, which began airing on the 26th of November 1977 and concluded on the 17th of December. Here are the individual viewing figures for all 4 episodes, and this is quite a nice little boost. Every part pulled in more than 8 million viewers, the first story of Season 15 to do so. The peak also comes with Part 2, which had 9.5 million households tuning in, and thanks to this boost in numbers overall, the show made a triumphant return into the top 40 programmes chart. Parts 2 and 3 both charted in the lower sections, with Part 3 placing highest at 35th. So it seems like the Sunmakers had roughly 1 million extra viewers watching them before. What factors played in its favour? On the promotional front, the story received a short trailer immediately after the conclusion of Image of the Fendahl. This trend of having promotional trailers immediately after an adventure's end isn't something Doctor Who had never done before, but for them to have them for every story for the season thus far is quite refreshing. Plus, it helps keep the viewers watching excited and intrigued about the next adventure. Aside from that though, promotion for the Sunmakers was arguably a little lackluster compared to, say, a story like The Invisible Enemy. Aside from a black and white photo of Tom Baker to promote Part 1, the Radio Times didn't go out of its way to give Doctor Who any more space within its magazine. Competition from ITV was still fairly strong, Man from Atlantis being shown against the Time Lord in most of the bigger regions, and continuing to overtake Doctor Who in terms of viewing figures. Though again, the fact that such heavy competition was present, and yet Doctor Who viewership was still respectable, and now increasing with this story, is a defiant stance of resistance to say the least. We also must take the time of year into account. Airing across November and December, British nights would have been getting darker and colder, resulting in more people being inside to watch the telly at 6:05 on a Saturday evening. It could certainly be believed that this shift in the seasons helped this serial gain nearly 1 million more viewers across its 4 parts. The Sunmakers itself is another story from Season 15 that arguably gets overlooked quite a lot. It's written by recently departed script editor Robert Holmes, and is often one of the least talked about stories amongst fans. Indeed, the story's immense focus on taxation echoes the many economic troubles that the UK faced back in the mid to late 70s. I'm all for socio-political elements within Doctor Who, but I can understand how it may have turned some people off in this case. However, again, like a lot of Season 15, the Sunmakers does have its moments of brilliance. I think Louise Jameson gives one of her best performances as Leela, and Louise herself has stated numerous times that she found the Sunmakers to be her favourite serial to work on. So whilst it may get buried within many other more memorable Who adventures, don't be afraid to give it another go if you fancy it. I mean, it's a Robert Holmes script, you're bound to get some sharp-witty dialogue if nothing else. Overall, this story attracted an average of 8.8 million viewers, a 1 million increase from the previous story. This boost is great to see, showing that the downward trajectory that Season 15 began with was firmly put to a halt. The winter weather coming in arguably had a big part to play in the boost of the Time Lord's viewing figures, which is all the more impressive considering the relative lack of promotion and strong competition from ITV. We also have some repeat data for you. The Sunmakers was the second in a line of summer repeats, following on from The Invisible Enemy. Airing over 4 consecutive Thursdays from the 10th to the 31st of August, here are the viewing figures for this repeat. Like the repeat of The Invisible Enemy, these numbers are generally lower, but they do pick up as the story progressed, reaching a 7.1 million peak with Part 4, compared to the 3.2 million that tuned in for Part 1. The 5.8 million average is a 0.2 increase from The Invisible Enemy repeat, and considering it was facing off against the same strong competition from ITV, this is hardly the worst showing that could have occurred. The Sunmakers may not be amongst the pantheon of all-time classics in Doctor Who's long history, but like most adventures, it's always worth going back to for another look in every now and then. And to do just that, you can read the Target book from 1982, or its audio adaptation from 2019. To watch it, you have the VHS release from 2001, with a DVD release following 10 years later in 2011. Robert Holmes would go on to contribute a couple more scripts for the Tom Baker era, before taking several years away from the programme. It's pretty undisputed as to the quality of work that Holmes produced, and even if the Sunmakers isn't near the top of that highly regarded list, if you're a completionist, it's one you'll have to watch eventually. It's fun in places, has some great moments, but ultimately for me, it's a Season 15 story that I don't revisit all that often. And speaking of stories I don't revisit too often...
Now, tell us about it. This is Leela, I'm the Doctor.
The fifth and penultimate story from Season 15 is Underworld. On the very edge of the universe, the TARDIS lands on an ancient spaceship. The ship's crew members are from the destroyed world of Minos, and are on a centuries-long mission to retrieve the race banks that could restore their people to life. This story is comprised of 4 episodes, which began airing on the 7th of January 1978 and concluded on the 28th of the same month. We'll get to the transmission date gap in just a moment. Here are the individual viewing figures for all 4 episodes, and this is more like it. The first 3 parts echo the numbers attained by the previous story, The Sunmakers, and Part 4 out of absolutely nowhere turns the dial up to 11. 11.7 million viewers as a matter of fact. The first individual episode of Season 15 to pass over 10 million too. All parts entered the top 40 TV programmes, except for the opening instalment which came 50th. Unsurprisingly, Part 4 charted highest, finishing at 27th place. So despite a few weeks off air, how did Underworld manage to not only keep the viewing figures at a high level, but give them a spike right at the very end? Well, firstly, we must address the few weeks off air itself. Similar to seasons 13 and 14, Doctor Who would have a mid-season break, which covered the Christmas-New Year period. Despite No Who airing on Christmas Eve, New Year's Eve and New Year's Day saw a 2-part compilation repeat of The Robots of Death, which garnered strong ratings for a re-aired story. I would argue this timely repeat helped Doctor Who retain most of the viewers it had gained during the Sunmakers, and also provided some much-needed hype for Season 15 resuming the following week. Speaking of hype, promotion was an interesting mix for this story. The traditional promotion was still quite low-key in terms of what was presented in the Radio Times. However, in other publications, Doctor Who was appearing due to the speculation of who was going to play the new companion. Louise Jameson's departure from the series had already been announced back in November, and it was widely speculated, and even falsely confirmed by some papers, that Imogen Bickford-Smith, who played Tala in Underworld, would be joining the TARDIS. Suffice to say, this did not happen, but even if these rumours helped circulate buzz amongst the general public, then it could only serve in Doctor Who's favour. To round off the promotional angle, there was one TV moment that could have arguably played into Part 4's extremely high viewing figures. K9, the Doctor's robot dog, made an appearance on Jim'll Fix It. One viewer wished to meet K9, and did so, and the moment transmitted on Saturday the 28th of January, the day of Part 4's broadcast, and directly before Doctor Who. So to see K9 in this show could have caused more viewers to keep the dial on BBC One to watch the TARDIS team as they were about to appear. Of course, I don't have definitive proof that this is a direct cause, but I would argue that it's fairly plausible. For competition over on ITV, things started off similar, but then were changed up a bit. For the first half of Underworld's broadcast, it faced off against Man from Atlantis. However, the second half faced off against a variety of different programmes. Part 3 mainly fought off Logan's Run, a new American sci-fi show that was based on the 1976 Hollywood film of the same name. However, for the following week, Logan's Run got pushed to an earlier time slot, resulting in Doctor Who going against a mishmash of different shows depending on the region that you lived in. These shows included former opponents such as Happy Days and Code R, but also new challengers in the form of documentary series Havoc and action series The $6 Million Man. The mix of relatively weaker competition for Part 4 could have definitely also played into that episode's higher showing of 11.7 million viewers. Underworld sadly became one of those classic Who stories that is remembered for one particular thing and not much else. In this case, it's the very ropey blue screen effects that dominate this story to an almost unbearable level. Working under tight economic circumstances and ever-looming strike actions, the decision to film large portions of the story against a blue screen was certainly a bold move in 1978. Star Wars had arrived in the UK not long before Underworld began, and the incredible special effects achieved on such a high Hollywood budget made Doctor Who look even cheaper by comparison. However, effects do not solely make a show, and in Doctor Who's case, the story, characters and performances have often provided the most rewarding viewing experiences. In my view, the story for Underworld isn't particularly compelling, nor do I find the characters that engaging. Though I do recognise the immense pressures both the actors and the production team must have been placed under, especially when working with the extensive and complex and often sporadic special effects. As an example of how far they were willing to push the boundaries, it's an admirable example, for sure, but one of the all-time classics of Who history? Unfortunately, it's gonna have to be a no from me. Overall, this story attracted an average of 9.7 million viewers, a 0.9 increase from the previous story. The boost is welcomed, as we are now on an upward trajectory for Season 15, as opposed to a downward one. The Christmas break didn't seem to hinder viewership, and Part 4's double-figure results helped immensely. It's also nice to see that despite the arrival of Star Wars, alongside the slew of glossy, high-budget American sci-fi shows arriving on British TV, the audiences in their millions were still ready and waiting to tune into the Doctor's newest adventures, regardless of how they looked or told their stories in comparison. If you wish to see Underworld in action for yourself, you can read the Target book from 1980 or its audio adaptation from 2021. To watch it, it was another late release on VHS, finally reaching buyers in 2002. It arrived on DVD in 2010, packaged with the Time Monster and the Horns of Nimon as part of the Myths and Legends box set. It's not perfect, far from it, but I see Underworld as being one of those examples of old TV that you stick on after a few drinks with a bunch of friends and you can still get some sort of entertainment out of it. Perhaps not the entertainment that was intended, but a fun time nonetheless. Like the Sunmakers, it's one I don't go back to often, but I'm sure next time I do, I'll give it as much another chance as any Doctor Who story in its near 60-year history.
What kept you, K9?
Gratitude is unnecessary. Speed is vital.
The sixth and final story from Season 15 is the invasion of time. The Doctor allies himself with the Vardans and paves the way for an invasion of the Time Lord homeworld, Gallifrey. Leela joins forces with the Outsiders to repel the invaders, but the Vardans are only the puppets of a far greater threat, the Sontarans. This story is comprised of 6 episodes, which began airing on the 4th of February 1978 and concluded on the 11th of March. Here are the individual viewing figures for all 6 episodes, and what a way to close out the season. These numbers are a fantastic boost from many previous stories in Season 15, with 4 of the 6 parts crossing over the 10 million mark. Part 2 providing the peak, with 11.4 million households tuning in. And even the lowest figure, Part 3's 9.5 million, is a strong showing in its own right. For the top 40 TV programmes, 5 out of the story's 6 parts charted, all except Part 3, which just missed out at 47th place. Parts 1 and 4 take joint first place here, as they both finished up at 28th. After a season that for the most part didn't replicate the exceptionally high viewing figures of its predecessor, how did the Invasion of Time manage to pull it out of the bag right at the end of the run? Competition over on ITV remained largely unchanged during the Invasion of Time's 6 weeks. A mixture of programmes depending on the region, none of which necessarily carrying the same impact that Man from Atlantis had done just a few months prior. Promotion on the other hand was ramped up a little for this story. Like all the others from Season 15, a short trailer was aired before Part 1 hit the air, alerting viewers that the new adventure would be set on the Doctor's home planet of Gallifrey. I mentioned this when we took a look at last year's Deadly Assassin, and it still rings true here, that Gallifrey still held a lot of mystery and intrigue back in the 1970s, and any chance to see it on screen would have undoubtedly increased the excitement and buzz amongst regular viewers. In the print medium, the press were making a big focus on Leela's departure from the series. Some claimed that the 17 Warriors' presence within the show had helped boost the adult viewership to around 60%. Where they got that statistic from and whether that was categorically true is a bit beyond me, but I'm sure you can guess as to what they're alluding at. Nevertheless, like before, this sort of press could only have served as positive for Doctor Who, as those who were fans of Leela, regardless of their age, would have had more of an inclination to tune in to see how she would depart from the Doctor. During the Invasion of Time's run, Doctor Who was back in the papers, this time promoting the sale of all Tom Baker episodes thus far to the American TV market. This wasn't the first time Doctor Who had been aired in the States. Several Jon Pertwee episodes had gone out in the early 70s, but had attracted little attention. This time, however, Doctor Who would begin to gain a following in the States, partly due to the success of Star Wars in the cinema, which almost single-handedly rejuvenated science fiction stateside. The other factor of the story that was amped up was the return of the Sontarans, the clone warrior race who only after 2 prior appearances had gone on to become quite a hit amongst fans. Saying that, they may only appear in the latter half of the adventure, as they were preceded by the Vardans, who look, questionable, but the Sontarans' return is just as fun as it had been before, and the idea that one of the Doctor's most recognisable foes could feasibly conquer his home planet must have been quite alarming back in 1978. The Invasion of Time isn't necessarily a fan favourite, though I have learnt that many, myself included, find it somewhat of a guilty pleasure. Similar to Underworld, this story suffered the effects of strike action within the TV industry, with many of the TARDIS interior sets being filmed in a disused hospital. That, combined with some hokey dialogue and some questionable performances and plot points in places, it all doesn't help in regard to the Invasion of Time's wider reputation amongst fans. However, after all of that, I find this story a great time to watch through. It's a 6-part story, which I know immediately turns some people off from giving it a go, but I think it has many a memorable moment, and for me at least, it feels like a proper comfort food story, and a nice way to close off a season that has certainly been up and down in terms of the stories I've enjoyed. Out of all of Season 15, I would single out this story as the one you should give a second chance to above all the others. Have another watch of it, and I would hope you can see many of the elements of fun and excitement that it provides. Overall, this story attracted an average of 10.5 million viewers, a 0.8 increase from the previous story. To finish on an increase rather than a drop is certainly a positive, and this actually makes the Invasion of Time the most watched story of the season when based on viewing figure averages. Sure, it may have had 2 extra parts to gain that extra viewership, but it so easily could have swung the other way. The Invasion of Time may not be anyone's particular favourite Doctor Who story, but when we're talking guilty pleasures, this is always the first story that I jump to. And if you want to check it out, you can read the Target book from 1980, or its audio adaptation from 2016. To watch it, you have a double tape release on VHS from the year 2000, or a standalone DVD release from 2008. After a change in production team and shaky ground in terms of viewing figures, the Invasion of Time allows Season 15 to close out on a high. Returning villains, the Doctor's home planet, Time Lords aplenty, and the departure of Leela and K9, this all must have been an overload for a viewer watching on broadcast. But as mentioned before, this is a proper comfort food story to me. I enjoy it for its wackiness, its silliness in places, and its stellar moments too. Grab your drinks and your snacks, and just relax and enjoy the madness.
You're surprised. In the name of liberty and honor, I sentence you to death, traitor.
So that's Season 15, the 6 stories that comprise it, and the ratings that they garnered. With the transmission of Episode 6 of The Invasion of Time, Season 15 was brought to an end, concluding a 6-month run comprised of 26 episodes across 6 stories. Now, let's have a look at the story averages for this season. We can see that overall, viewing figures were noticeably lower than those achieved over the previous 3 seasons. The most viewed story, and indeed the only one to average over 10 million, is the finale, The Invasion of Time, which averaged out at 10.5 million viewers. The least viewed story is The Image of the Fendahl, which had 7.8 million households on average tuning in. The first half of the season is very much on a downward trajectory, but it's reassuring to see the second half pick it up and keep it rising right until the very end. When looking at all 6 averages, these numbers are far from being considered a failure or a disaster, but I can understand when immediately seeing these set against the incredible highs of Tom Baker's first 3 years, that they may have been seen as a disappointment of some kind, particularly by BBC higher-ups. Now, as we always do, let's work out the overall average for this season. By combining the average ratings of each story, we can calculate that the average for Season 15 of Doctor Who stands at around roughly 8.9 million viewers. This is a staggering 2.3 million drop from the previous season average, and becomes the first season of the Tom Baker era to average out at under 10 million. This may sound like a major negative, but when compared with the rest of the seasons we've covered so far, this is still one of the strongest performers. It actually ranks in 5th place as the most viewed season on average when compared to its predecessors. But again, where the BBC is concerned, this overall average must have come as quite a shock. When we look at the 4 Tom Baker seasons thus far, the difference is obvious. However, as we've discussed, this was down to a whole manner of factors, including strong competition and not the strongest bout of promotion. Season 15 in many ways, I feel, was up against it from the start. The change in production team, and indeed the change in the whole style and tone of the programme, was bound to alienate some viewers. That, combined with the polarising introduction of K9, the departure of Leela, and the surprise challenger in the form of Man from Atlantis, really made this season the first in years to really have the chips stacked against it. However, in spite of all these obstacles, Doctor Who still came out winning in many of these respects. To still be gaining 8, 9 or even 10 million viewers despite the challenging factors mentioned is staggering. Most shows would lose a ton of their viewership and swiftly be pushed aside, but Doctor Who was different, not just as a programme in itself, but in regards to its audience. Whether they had joined for the first time or had been with the programme for years, the appeal that Doctor Who still retained with many demographics of the British public was more than clear for all to see. And as Tom Baker grins wildly into the camera at the end of Season 15, I think all of us know as audience members that the Doctor is still going strong, and certainly isn't going anywhere anytime soon. So those are the ratings details for Season 15. I hope you enjoyed this numerical look back at a run of stories that I find often get a bit overlooked in the wider pantheon of Doctor Who adventures. And whether you enjoy these stories or not, I think we can all agree that somewhere in there's a little bit of fun for everyone to enjoy along the way. If you want to see more great Doctor Who content, then I highly recommend the Who Knew podcast, in which host Josh Carr interviews folks from across the world of Doctor Who, including writers, directors, actors, and content creators, including yours truly. If you want to read more about Doctor Who in the making of it, I highly recommend the Complete History series of books, which I used as reference for this video. If you want to keep up to date with this series, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to see new episodes of the series early, then you can by supporting us on Patreon or via my Ko-fi page. Please consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and leaving your thoughts on Season 15 in the comments section below. I've been Martyn from AMTV, and we will see you next time for Season 16.